Here in Chapter 5, we're going to go over long-term memory, which has a lot of moving parts to it. And moving memory is an overarching idea of memory storage and encoding and decoding and all sorts of fun stuff. So we're going to walk through this. This will help us to establish kind of a baseline for how we understand putting information into our brains and trying to get it back out. In Chapter 4, we covered short-term memory, which we know now as working memory, and the kind of initial phases of getting information put into that long-term storage. Now we're going to focus on the long-term storage. So by way of introduction, all the information that's stored in your mind constitutes memory. That's short-term working memory, that's long-term memory, that's a memory about how to do something, it's memory about an event that happened, it's memory about yourself, it's even memories of what you might do. Like if you have to do something, that's still a memory, but it's something that you will do or might do, like going to the grocery store. So there are lots of other cognitive processes that memory is connected to, and we touched on that a bit in Chapter 4 by talking about how we have some like visual imagery, which is a memory of what something looks like. And all of our senses, by the way, have that. You can think about how something feels, for example. So you can have tactile memory about something, and it can integrate into a long-term memory, but it's also part of your tactile system. Right. So let's talk about encoding, how we get information in. And the way we're going to do that is by talking about first just the overview of working memory and then the process for getting things in there. And then some of the interesting things about why things seem to get into our long-term memory better than others. So just kind of some questions more in a rhetorical nature. Are you more likely to remember items that you processed in a deep, meaningful fashion rather than items processed in a shallow, superficial fashion? I hope by now, at this stage in your academics, you kind of recognize that, well, yeah, probably if you process things deeply and more meaningfully, then it is going to get processed better. Okay. Are you likely to remember items if the context at the time of encoding matches the context at the time of retrieval? And spoiler alert, yes. There's an encoding specificity that we have. And if we can encode something in the same setting as that we decode it, it's usually going to go better for us. Something else that people don't often think about, and this is less of a no-brainer, is how do emotional factors influence memory accuracy? If we are very emotional about something, are we able to remember things as easily? Or do our emotions skew the way that our memory either encodes or decodes the information? So we'll look into that as we go through. And by the way, we'll touch on this stuff in future chapters too. So don't treat this as, oh, this is the only time we talk about it. It'll come up again. So levels of processing is referring to the idea that there are some things that we can do to make learning something a little bit easier to do. Okay. So in that way, we have shallow information processing. And the shallow information processing is usually just trying to remember a number or something like that, and just flat out, just trying to plug it into your brain. But there are ways to remember things in more meaningful ways. And you may have thought about these already without kind of knowing that you're talking about levels of processing. You're probably more likely to remember a phone number if it has a particular pattern. And pattern is a different level of processing. It's a little bit deeper than just remembering numbers. Or if the number is like something else. Like if you have somebody's phone number you're trying to remember and the last four numbers of their phone number are by some chance the last four of your social security number. You're much more likely to remember that because there's a depth of processing. I mean, you already know the numbers, but you also connect those to something about you, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Well, next slide, really. Okay. Sometimes we can remember things or process things into memory by what they mean versus what they look like. So you can look, oh, there's a red ball, and you could process it into your mind. But if you know that that red ball belonged to somebody, it means something to somebody, then you'll remember that thing more than not. Like, for example, where did I put that red ball? Excuse me. If it's a meaningless red ball, you may not really think about where it is because you didn't think about that red ball when you put it down. However, if you know that ball belong to someone very special to you, you're probably more likely to pay attention to it when you put it down. So not to bring another thing in like attention, but the idea that you know something about that ball brings meaning to it. Things that are distinctive tend to make it into our memory. Things that have more elaboration to them, also things that we know more about. If it's a red ball, but it has a fancy design on it, for example, that could be both distinctive and elaborate, and you can elaborate on the particular notion of that ball. But elaboration also refers to kind of blend these things together. Elaboration also refers to what something might mean to you. So if something is distinct, you can elaborate on it because it means something to you. It gets processed more deeply. Okay. So overall, that deep processing is also enhanced for the memory of faces. So if somebody looks like somebody you know, you're more likely to remember that person because you have some kind of connection to that. But also we know that faces are special. There's a special part of the brain that's responsible for processing faces, and so faces just more naturally are memorable to us. So let's talk about a particular level of processing that's called the self-reference effect. And the self-reference effect is when we can connect information to ourselves, either our lives or something about us. For example, we can leverage the levels of processing using the self-reference effect, because if we try to remember something like that red ball, for example, if we just remember that, the red ball was over on the table when I left, you can think to yourself, it's on the red table that I used to write down notes when I need to think about what to get at the grocery store. So you can kind of remember that the red ball was somewhere that's related to you, but it's also about meaning. You can also think about the red ball in terms of the table that is missing a leg or whatever. It's kind of a silly example, but that would also make it distinctive. And there's been a lot of research. In particular, it's mentioned here, Rogers and colleagues. There are three little bits of research in there, but the one that I like to talk about most is that second one. This is the one that says factors responsible for the self-reference effect from the textbook. That's the Tolving-Rosenbaum example, by the way. When we think about things in terms of ourself, we are able to, again, leverage those things that are known to us and are about us. But what happens is that we also think about ourselves in the context of other people. So I know we've been talking about this stupid red ball now for too many examples, but there are lots of things that we can also situate in terms of other people. For example, you may have a distinct long-term memory for a first date with somebody. You can think back, where was that place? Oh, that's right. I remember now. We were sitting down at this table, but I remember where the restaurant was. And you think, oh, wait a second. I remember picking you up and driving there. So all of a sudden you think about this episodic memory that you have about a first date. And it's because you've got some kind of a reference for it from your own perspective, but also using the perspective of somebody else, or interacting or engaging with somebody else's perspective, like having picked them up and then taking them to the restaurant, for example. There are some other little bits of research that came from earlier research that talked about visual and acoustic and semantic characteristics. So if we can develop more kind of this self-reference effect, but also including the visual, acoustic, and semantic characteristics, then we can strongly increase our ability to incorporate information and process it more deeply in long-term memory, which, for example, is why we do the assignments in this class that we do, where you have to tie something into your everyday life. So it helps you to understand that these things don't just happen out there, they happen to yourself, and that's kind of that self-reference effect. Okay. So once again, the self-reference effect uses that rich set of cues. We can elaborate by connecting to other people. And last thing I didn't mention on the last slide was that the material that you're trying to remember that's based on the self-reference effect, you usually rehearse it more because it's about you. We tend to be self-absorbed people, not necessarily a negative way, although we can be self-absorbed in a negative way, but we can. We oftentimes ruminate and think about things and rehearse things in our minds, and the more we do that, the more we can engage with that deeper processing. So not just like thinking about it and processing it deeply, but we have like this deep engagement where we kind of go around and around with information, and not just like remembering things like phone numbers, but thinking about, how am I gonna do this presentation, or what am I gonna say when I have to give a speech somewhere. Or how am I going to make dinner? And you might think to yourself, I remember that I need to get this thing at the grocery store when I go home. Then I'm going to, well, that's right, I have to clean the pot and pans first because I forgot I didn't do the dishes last night. So all of a sudden, you can develop kind of like this procedure. So you can develop a procedural memory for what you will do. I know that we usually think of memory in the past, but if you can remember something that you will do, then it's technically still a memory, even though it's in the future. But this information will allow you to rehearse and to get things into long-term memory. That way, when it's time to do it, you aren't having to do all the mental lifting in that moment. So this processing can be very helpful. And again, it's part of that self-reference effect, right? And rehearsal becomes a very strong strategy for long-term learning. A specific type of level of processing that you can use, and that we use natively, by the way, not just actively, is the encoding specificity principle. And one of the ways that we see this in everyday life is when we are doing something like giving a test in school. One of the examples that I use is when you have an in-person exam at some schools, like the University of Olivet, and you have an exam period that is not at the same time or date necessarily as the class that you took. And most people think, well, that doesn't much matter, it's just information. Yeah, but there is something about the context of the learning that makes retrieval easier if you can decode in the same way that you encoded the information. For example, learning about a topic like, let's say, cognition at 8 o'clock in the morning is hard enough, and then having to take an exam on it later in the afternoon is a completely different disposition. You have a different level of alertness. It's a different time of the day. It feels a little bit different. If you're middle in the afternoon, you're probably looking at that siesta time, which nobody wants to take an exam during. And maybe you're looking for an afternoon snack or something. It's just a different time of the day, and that can interfere with your ability to bring information into your awareness, to retrieve it from long-term memory. You're more likely to forget things, in short. And this next study this is a study, but this next slide talks about a study about the ability to retrieve information in one context compared to the context that you encoded it in. In this example, we're looking at an encoding language. Remember, encoding is about getting information in. So if people learn something in Spanish, this blue line, and in English, this blue line, okay? This white line. If people encode the language or the information in Spanish, and then they retrieve the information in Spanish, the blue line, and they retrieve the information in English, which is not how they encoded it, then their retrieval, or percent correct, but their retrieval accuracy is lower. Okay. Same thing is if you learn information in English and then try to retrieve it in Spanish, it's a lot lower. But if you encode information in English and decode it or retrieve it in English, you have a higher success rate. This demonstrates that learning in the language and encoding and then retrieving it in a different language is less helpful, significantly so. So this is one demonstration of that encoding specificity principle. And this is about language, but it could also be about location or time or whatever, or just general atmosphere and environment. Okay? So you could, you could learn something at the beginning of the semester when it's bright and sunny out, and then and warm. But when you're trying to retrieve it for that exam at the end of the year, it could be cold and snowy, and that can throw you off. We're very susceptible to these forces with regard to retrieval of information. Okay, so more specifically about the encoding specificity principle, there are different kinds of memory tasks that we recognize are susceptible to this. So that's recall versus recognition. So remember that recall is the ability for you to just flat out remember something, and recognition is whether or not you could see it and know that you've seen it before. We also have these real life or things that have high ecological validity situations versus lab settings. We also have short delay versus long delay. In short, encoding specificity is particularly strong when you're recalling information as opposed to recognizing it. Even though recognition is an easier task, that effect is stronger in recall situations. Also in real life situations as opposed to lab settings that don't have ecological validity, because you can use a deeper level of processing if you are referring to a real life thing rather than a lab setting. And also it's particularly effective for long-term situations, long delay, like when you have to memorize something from a long time ago. Not to say that it's better to try to retrieve things from a long time ago to demonstrate memory principles, but specifically the encoding specificity principle is very strong for long-term delay situation as opposed to recent ones, mostly because the encoding specificity is one of the last things for you to lose if you're going to lose a memory. Like, you might forget what exactly you said on your first date, but you remember exactly where it was. So you'll remember the conditions where you encoded something, even if you can't recall the exact thing that you encoded. So the long delay situations are particularly strong for encoding specificity. Okay. And as I alluded to earlier, the physical context is sometimes secondary to the mental context. Like I said, it can be more difficult to retrieve information if your class is at a different time when you take your exam compared to when you learn it. But again, that mental context, the fact that it's cold and everything, which is a physical thing, but it also puts you in a certain mental state. We know how winter makes us feel. So the mental state is sometimes different depending on, or for at the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester, which contributes to the encoding specificity principle as well. The next several slides still talk about the specificity encoding principle, but what's interesting about it is that it talks about the different ways that information is encoded, and it kind of blends together then the levels of processing approach, which talks about how information is put into long-term memory. And the encoding specificity principle then asks, how do we get it back out in the context of things like depth of processing, so what things mean, what are their superficial characteristics that we're trying to remember and such. Again, this is information that we saw in demonstration 5.1 in the text. If you did that, when you think about like what a word means in terms of the characteristic of it, like a rhyme, or if something is semantically related, these studies have shown us that if we try to get information out in the same way that we put it in, then it's much more effective. So if I ask you to remember what something means, as in the example from demonstration 5.1, if I say, the girl walked down the house, and I ask you yes or no, does that make sense? You're probably going to say no, because it doesn't make sense. And then if I ask you 5 minutes later, something like, what did the girl walk down? And you would say the house. Even though, it didn't make sense then, you recognized that it was something that semantically didn't make sense. And I asked you the same question, what did the girl walk down? You would still say house because you knew that it was house because I asked you semantically what she walked down, and that's how you encoded it. However, if I were to ask you 5 minutes after I first asked you the sentence, if I were to say something like, which word rhymed with mouse? You may have a harder time finding it because rhyming is not as deep as semantic information. So the physical characteristics of the word house weren't really processed for you. It was more, did it make sense in the sentence, which is semantic, which is a deeper way of processing. Okay. So in that way, we can leverage the encoding specificity principle, not just in terms of context, but also in terms of how we processed it. So now we're trying to blend things together. Encoding specificity then lines up with our levels or depth of processing approach. And that was the ultimate conclusion by Bransford in that study, is that semantic processing is effective only if the retrieval conditions also emphasize deeper, more meaningful features, like the meaning of the word. All right, so let's shift over to emotions, mood, and memory. Memory is not just a method where we input information because it's presented to us as stimuli, but it's also wrapped up into the emotions that you have: sadness, happiness, what mood you're in, and how those two things correlate to input memory. And it also shifts how your memory is input. We've all known that we've had negative memories associated with negative feelings and things like that, and that's because we have a context for how we bring information into our storehouse. So let's start off with the Pollyanna principle, which is a psychological bias, sometimes called the positivity bias, where we tend to remember things that are more positive more than things that are negative. And that seems like a reasonable thing to do. The problem is that sometimes, especially like in relationships, not to get too clinical with it, people will oftentimes only remember the good things about a relationship and not remember the bad things about a relationship. And that can be problematic because that means that you may not protect yourself against negative things in a relationship, or you might not choose to quote unquote work on the things in the relationship because you don't recognize them, which could be frustrating for somebody else that you're in a relationship with. So the Pollyanna principle is, again, that cognitive bias that says that we usually process things more efficiently when they're positive than when they are not so positive. And that's not to say that we don't remember bad things. We definitely do remember bad things, and very vividly sometimes, but that doesn't mean that they're processed more efficiently. So remember, this isn't about our ability to recall information if it's positive or negative. It's about how it gets processed and how reasonably we put it into a storehouse and create connections that are easy to then retrieve the information without so much bias. So again, it's kind of the same thing as the encoding specificity principle, where it doesn't mean that you won't be able to memorize things. It just means that retrieval is better in the same sense, or in the same condition that you encoded information into. So same thing with the Pollyanna principle. The way that we have tested this was through, as you can imagine, an experimental method where we asked people to remember words that have some kind of emotional meaning to them. So words that are more positive might be something like hope or beauty or something like that. Negative words might be something like loss or insult. And then there are some neutral words in there too, like the word travel or the word liberty, or maybe the word, what's another example that I've seen? The word style, I think, pops up every so often. Using those words as memory aid, or not memory aids, but as memory triggers. So those words will be memorized, and then the participants will be asked to reproduce them. And what they found was that the rate of reproduction of the words that they were supposed to memorize were that the pleasant words had a greater recall rate than the unpleasant words, which had a greater recall rate than the neutral words. So this kind of shows us the hierarchy that when you have emotional encoding, the pleasant words, the positive emotions have precedent in terms of memory and recall. The unpleasant words tend to be second, then the neutral words tend to be last. So emotion is tied to memory. We can kind of see that in this demonstration, even if it's positive or negative, even though positive emotions tend to have a precedent over negative. In an interesting study with Waring and Kensinger, there was a picture version of a study that tied emotion to memory. And what would happen is they would ask people to judge images if they were positive, negative, or neutral. And the photos also had backgrounds, so it'd be a piece of candy like sitting on a table, for example, or an orange out in a field somewhere. They would be looking at these images and they would ask, the thing in that picture, is it positive, negative, or neutral? So they found kind of this baseline that said that some are positive, some are negative, some are neutral. Then another group of people came in and the researchers said, I want you to study these pictures, and later I'm going to ask you some questions about them, whether or not you've seen them before. So the people looked at all the pictures, and then after the trial, they were asked to look at the pictures and asked if they had seen them before. And as you would expect, the things that were positive and negative had a higher recall rate than the ones that were neutral, because the depth of processing included emotional connection, whether it was positive or negative. The neutral stimuli were a lot less, because the neutral stimuli didn't necessarily trigger any kind of strong encoding in multiple ways, or a depth of processing. And that kind of is summarized here. And what was interesting about this is that for the people who scored high in recall, for the positive and negative pictures, they weren't able to identify the backgrounds when asked about the backgrounds. But when they looked at the neutral backgrounds, the backgrounds that were associated with the neutral pictures, the recall rate for the backgrounds of those pictures was higher. Because when we are attending to a stimulus that's interesting to us, that has high emotional connectedness, like the positive or negative pictures, we don't pay attention to the peripheral information. But when we see something that's neutral, we tend to pay attention to the things that are peripheral. It's kind of like watching a boring movie, where all of a sudden you're not really paying attention to the plot line. Maybe you're looking at the cars going by and like, oh, I have a car like that, or looking at the background or something like that. So when your attention is not captivated by something like emotion or just basic interest in the case of a movie, we tend to pay attention to the peripheral information. This is a chart that demonstrates the differences between the recognition of the stimulus in the stimulus situation compared to the background information. Okay. And again, the recognition for the background and neutral stimuli is greater than either. Even though it's close to the positive stimuli group, it's still significantly different, because that's how statistics work. Even though it's only 4% difference, that 4% is significant. Then the last point about emotions and memory is that over time, unpleasant memories fade more than unpleasant memories. And sometimes this sounds ironic, but let's walk through an example and see what this looks like. In a study of students, they asked students to recall a negative idea or thought or event every day, and then they asked people to rate them on a positivity scale, and they wanted to know if these things were least positive to most positive, so negative to positive. And then the researchers asked them again to rate those same ideas or things that they wrote down sometime later. In this case, the study's been replicated, but in this case, they used 3 months of time between when they recorded their events and then when they went back and re-rated them. In this particular study, they had two groups of people. One group of people had a tendency toward depression and one did not. What was interesting about it is that for the people that did not have a tendency towards depression, they rated the events more positively after a 3-month time period than when they rated them originally. So they demonstrated the positivity effect, or the Pollyanna principle. But those people with depressive tendencies didn't have that fading over time, and they rated the events close to what they rated them initially, suggesting that for depressed people, so a kind of a clinical finding, that the positivity effect does not take over, and they still maintain negative feelings about things when they've had them in the past. So again, we have some evidence for encoding and retrieval differences based on emotion, and mood is the depressed characteristic that we're talking about here. So that there's very interesting things, or interesting studies about how we can measure things that tend to be very obscure and abstract, like encoding. So it's fun that we can kind of do that with cognition in a way that, we don't have to like probe brains or anything like that. We can see the evidence for these things, even though we can't see what the brain is doing in that exact moment unless we use MRI and things like that. But lacking that, we can definitely rely on experimental methods that have been replicated and found to be consistent across different populations. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about retrieval in memory. So retrieval usually comes in two different flavors, especially in a common cognition textbook like the one that we're using, that we have implicit and explicit memory tasks. So the definition of an explicit memory task is when I ask you to memorize something and then you try to recall that thing. That is an explicit memory task. So if I say, hey, I need you to remember this address, and then you remember the address, and then you've successfully remembered it, and you have successfully completed an explicit memory task. Cool. And explicit memory tasks usually come in two different flavors. I can ask you to recall something. So if I say, what was that address again? And you tell me the address. Or I could ask you to recognize something, where I would have a list of maybe 10 addresses, and I say to you, which one of these is the address that you saw before? Those are common explicit memory tasks. Implicit memory tasks ask you to recall or recognize something based on some kind of information that is more subtle to you. And I'm better off showing you an example than trying to demonstrate it to you through me just defining it. So here we go. In demonstration 5.3 from the text, you have an implicit and explicit memory task. The first explicit memory task would be to look at these words listed here in this table, and then I would ask you to take a break and then try to recall as many of those as you could, or I'd ask you to recognize whether these words were from the original list. So I could explicitly measure your ability to to recall or to recognize the information that I asked you to remember. Okay, that's explicit. It happens because I told you to. In an implicit memory task, I could ask you to complete some words based on information that you had before. And I know this is a contrived example, but it's one of those experiments that have a lot of internal validity because we can control the conditions. But if I ask you to memorize these three things, or if I ask you to look at this, and then sometime later I say, hey, fill in the blanks as best you can, you're likely to use the words from above to do it, even if other ones could fit it. And in this particular case, you're kind of stuck with the words that it could be, but I suppose if you were clever enough, you could come up with different words than what are here. But this is implicit memory, where I could say fill in the blanks here, not saying which of those words fit in there, but I would just say fill in the blanks, and you could do it relatively quickly because you have prior information that kind of creeps out. Now, another way I could test your implicit memory is through a repetition task. We call it repetition priming. So I could say to you, look at this list of words. Okay, you look at it for a while. Then sometime later, maybe the next day, I say, name 3 rooms in a typical house. You might come up with some rooms in a house, but you're very likely to come up with the word kitchen because that was from the original list. Name 3 kinds of animals. You're likely to name some animals, and among them would be a horse. And then name 3 different kinds of stores. You probably name 3 stores, but among them is likely to be a bookstore. And that's because we can use implicit information by priming it using repetition tasks. So if I ask you to repeat something like name 3 of something, you're likely to draw from prior information rather than just random information. So the overall research about implicit and explicit memory tasks suggests that people know more than what they can recall. So if I ask you, what were 3 things from that list, you could recall maybe 3 of them. And if I ask you to say 5, you could probably name 5. And then after that, we start to run into that magic number problem, and you can't remember 13 of them. But if I try to get this information out of you implicitly, like filling in blanks or something like that, you could probably remember more because you can rely on implicit learning to do that. Now, an interesting topic that people think about when it comes to long-term memory is this idea of amnesia. And amnesia is an interesting phenomenon because it's really cool in that people can lose big chunks of long-term memory. And I'm not going to show it to you here because it would actually get me a copyright claim on my own YouTube video. But if you follow the links in the presentations, you can see different types of amnesia and what it might look like. Just as a basic definition, the retrograde amnesia is when you lose information prior to when you have some kind of brain damage. And anterograde amnesia is when you lose information that happened after, or you have a hard time forming new memories after the brain damage. Probably one of the most widely known examples of anterograde amnesia comes from the movie 50 First Dates, where the main character can't create new memories after a certain head trauma. So it's just interesting. Interestingly, we have particular pathologies that can interfere with long-term memory retrieval and formation in the long term, especially with anterograde amnesia. Now, when people are able to access long-term memory more functionally than others, they can develop what's called an expertise. And everybody has the potential to have expertise. And really what that means is that the ability to use and network information and kind of this parallel distributed method, this networked modality that allows you to access long-term memory in very functional and connected ways so that you can draw connections to material that you need to retrieve in a way that others can't. And to other people who can't do something, for example, like play chess and imagine all these different moves that might seem almost magical to them, but they themselves have the capacity to do it. And what it comes down to is memory. So the general research says that there is a strong correlation between the knowledge that somebody has about an area and their memory performance, their ability to store information in a logical and ordered way and to retrieve it in a logical and ordered way. It's kind of like being able to find something in a messy room. If a room is messy, it's hard to find the thing, but if you organize it well and everything is logical and ordered, then you can find that thing more quickly. And to other people, it's like, wow, you know right where that was. It's like, yeah, because I organize it a certain way. What's interesting too is that this is context specific. So that means that the information that you have about one thing may not mean that you are really good at another thing when it comes to your expertise. And what else is interesting is that those people don't appear to have classical indicators of high intelligence. So just because somebody's an expert in something doesn't mean that they have overall intelligence. So if a novice has some information about something an expert does, why does an expert have the expertise and the novice hasn't developed the expertise yet if it's not about something like intelligence? So let's find out. So the first way is that experts possess this idea to structure what they put into their mind. So they organize it as it goes in. So they prioritize encoding over retrieval. Now, retrieval is still good, but the encoding makes the retrieval faster. It makes it easier for them to organize things. They can organize and recognize when they have to recall information as well. So if an expert is learning something new or is practicing or rehearsing, they're really good about understanding how to put the information into their memory system in order to make it easier to retrieve. Whereas somebody who's learning something for the first time might just try to learn it and they don't have a real strategy to put it into their long-term memory. That doesn't mean that experts always use conscious strategies. Maybe they stumbled upon it. Maybe they understand different patterns and things like that. And when you understand a pattern to something, then you can apply that pattern to other things. And then that's how retrieval can be made much more easy. Something that's also been found through research is that experts tend to have more vivid visuals for what they're recalling. So they can like close their eyes and think about something or imagine something. Or use visual imagery or spatial ability or rotation or something to retrieve what they're trying to retrieve. Experts also try to figure out why information that they are encoding is different from other information, which can be very helpful as we learned about identifying and retrieving information from long-term memory. We talked about object sorting way back in chapter 3. We were looking at attention, and we talked about feature integration, the circles with the little lines in them. We looked at that as a way to determine how easy it was to store something or to retrieve something. And we found that if we can find distinctive things about what we're trying to retrieve, then we could retrieve it faster. But also, if we recognize as we are encoding information into long term, if there's something distinct about it, then we can give ourselves a boost in the retrieval mechanisms by already declaring what is unique about that thing. Like if you're playing a sport or something like that, and somebody beats you on a play, you're going to remember that play and why they beat you on it. So you are going to be storing information about that play, what was unique about it, why you got beat on that play. You're going to be storing that in your long-term memory, so the next time that distinct thing happens, you'll be able to respond a different way. Experts also use rehearsal strategies that are more strategic. They're able to look at the rehearsal strategies and use a metacognitive process in order to put information into the storehouse. So distinctiveness is also one of those strategies, by the way. So it's point 4 and point 5 kind of blend together. But they recognize the importance of organizing in a way that makes retrieval easier. Again, these are not always conscious. People just kind of like stumble upon these processes, but they are important processes nonetheless. And experts also do a much better job with filling in the blanks when they can't remember everything. So if they recognize that there is a process and a procedure to whatever their field of expertise is in, and if there is something that they're missing, they're able to fill that in with the process and come up with solutions to what may be missing. These are all things that anybody can do, by the way. It just takes somebody who has expertise in order to acknowledge them. Okay. And one last thing about the metacognitive process is that experts are really good at predicting if a task is going to be difficult or not and monitoring their progress on that task. So, if you have a video game that you're playing and all of a sudden there's a mission that you have to go on, you can look at that and be like, man, that's going to take me forever. I really don't feel like doing it. Or there's got to be a better way to get something. And you can recognize that. And as you're doing the thing that you're doing in your video game, you might recognize that, man, this is taking me longer than I thought it was going to. So you're monitoring your progress, and you're like, hey, all of a sudden it's not worth it to do it. Okay. We could also extend this, by the way, to doing things like homework, where if you see a homework assignment and you look at the description, if you've been doing homework a long time, you do a pretty good job of identifying and predicting whether it's going to be difficult homework. And then as you're doing it, you're going to self-reflect and say, man, this is easier than I thought because I'm only spending a little bit of time on it when I thought I was going to spend a lot of time on it. So you get better and you start to get information, and And you can use that information to make predictions about how other things might go with regard to, for example, homework or some other level of expertise that you have. Hopefully by now you're all expert homework doers. Now, we've alluded to the idea of self-reference effects in other chapters, and we're going to move into that now in terms of long-term memory, about autobiographical memory. We especially talk about this when we talk about depth of processing or the levels of processing approach. And if we have something about us that we're trying to remember, we tend to do it better. So we have an entire autobiographical memory storage system where we have an idea of memories and retrieval strategies that are for things that related to us. So events and issues that are about us, and we call that autobiographical memory. Just like an autobiography is a self-written story, autobiographical memory is memory about yourself. So some characteristics of autobiographical memory is that we make errors sometimes, but it's generally pretty accurate for information. Usually when we make mistakes about autobiographical memory, it has to do with the things that are not directly related to the memory itself. So it might be small details or specific information and things that aren't necessarily central to the memory itself. Like you might remember that you had a really good time at your birthday party, and that it was a Chuck E. Cheese, but you might not remember what the weather was or something like that. My wife and I were actually just talking about something like this, where we were both watching a birthing video as we're about ready to welcome our third child. This is back in 2025, in case you're listening to this many years from now. And we're watching the birthing videos with the kids because we're going to have a home birth and everything. Yay. And the kids are going to be there. So we wanted to show them what it looked like. And my wife and I were both surprised looking at the first birthing video of our oldest to remember that, oh, we did have all the lights, and I thought the lights were turned down for this, but no, there were some lights on, and we were both interested. We didn't know. That was a peripheral thing to the birth. It wasn't central to it necessarily. And as we reflect on it, and we were like, yeah, I guess we did have the lights on, but that was something that we remembered about our own experience that we both had gotten wrong. Very curious. So kind of a shared memory lapse. And our memories will oftentimes also blend information. So what's interesting about that is that sometimes if you have an early childhood memory that you've heard people talking about, sometimes you will integrate the parts that they talked about into your own memory and create a new memory altogether. Maybe that's not quite accurate. It's not a new memory altogether, but you will incorporate the distortions into your own memory as if they were your own. Okay. There's also a consistency bias. And what that also means is that we apply our current mindset to our prior memories, and sometimes that can be unfair. Like, for example, if you have a memory of a time where you embarrassed yourself and everything, you might look back at it and be like, man, I was such a fool then. But back then, you were just, walking up the stairs. Maybe you weren't being so careful, but you're walking up the stairs and you tripped. Okay, big deal. But sometimes we apply what we now know to what we had done. And the bottom line here is that your feelings don't tell time. So if you feel a certain way now, you'll apply that to what it was like in the past as if that's how you should have felt. Moral of the story, don't beat yourself up over it. We're allowed to, make changes and not hold ourselves accountable in the past to awful things. We can just do better, right? Sure. Okay. Sometimes we also have to do what's called reality monitoring. And sometimes we can have these memories that are not completely fabricated, but details can be fabricated. Our memories are reconstructive and not reproductive, meaning that we reconstruct a memory every time we have it. It's not that it's just like a recording that's played over and over again. We'd have to tell the story over and over again. So reality monitoring is the ability for us to determine whether or not something occurred, was imagined, or if we've involved some details that weren't part of the initial memory itself. In comparison to reality monitoring, we also have source monitoring, which is the idea of remembering where a particular thing came from or where you heard something from. I do this a lot, and hopefully it's not with anything too critical. But every so often, I'll hear something and I'll be thinking about the memory that I had of it, and I'll think, oh yeah, that person said it, and it wasn't that person at all. It was somebody different. So I had an error in source monitoring. That's just an error in retrieval. You forget who the information was attached to. Sometimes it's not a big deal. Sometimes it's a big deal, but it just, depends. When you act on a faulty source monitoring, that can be problematic. I don't think I've done this in a way that's been like actually harmful. But sometimes I've thought, oh, that person, didn't turn in their assignment. I should send them an email. So I send an email to a person saying, hey, don't forget to turn in your assignment. And it's to the wrong person because I didn't accurately monitor the source of my misinformation at that point. And I sent my email to the wrong person. So reality monitoring and source monitoring kind of go together in that way to either successfully monitor who said what, or to identify if what somebody said was real or if it was fabricated. Another long-term memory peculiarity is called the flashbulb memory. And many people have had flashbulb memories. It's these ingrained memories that happen usually during times of, it can be good stress or bad stress, like you remember where you were when you got proposed to. It could be bad, you remember where you were when you heard that somebody had died. And usually people think that they can recall all the details because it's a flashbulb memory, and boy, it's like it's in your brain. You can't not know it. The reality is that you generally have a claim that these are vivid memories, but there are lots of details that get washed out in flashbulb memories, even though we have a strong recollection of what it was like to be at a place, and you think that you can contextualize it. You really can't. There are lots of things that you know about flashbulb memories, but especially the peripheral information may or may not be entirely accurate. Now, another, and then we'll spend some time on this, but another avenue to explore long-term memory, especially autobiographical memory, is through eyewitness testimony. When you witness something, especially if it's like a crime or something like that, you have a recollection of what happened, but the recollection may or may not be entirely accurate. And the example that we have here is inappropriate eyewitness testimony. And this is the Gary Graham case. And this is a pretty common case to talk about in situations like this. Gary Graham was convicted of, and by the way, you can look at some cases online about it. Oh, pardon me. Gary Graham was convicted based on eyewitness testimony of someone who saw his face for only 3 seconds. There wasn't anything else. There was a gun that was found that the jury knew about, but there wasn't any like DNA, fingerprints, blood, or anything that could link him to it in a material way. Okay. So that was the only evidence for it. And now he was executed in 2000 for his crimes. So we'll never know if he was guilty or not. But the only thing that imprisoned him and led to a guilty verdict was eyewitness testimony. Was that person right? We don't know. But what we do know is that there is a lot of question as to whether or not eyewitness testimony is valid. So one of the ways that we've explored eyewitness testimony is through the post-event misinformation effect. What a mouthful, right? When people experience an event, and especially if they are given misinformation about the event, that can influence them to think differently or to have a recollection that's different than what their initial one was. Okay. In a situation like that, it doesn't even have to be anything that's like dubious or anything like that. It could just be you had a recollection and someone else told the story of the same thing that you saw, and they introduced something into the story that you didn't remember, but then you adopted as your own version of it, or you incorporated into your version thinking that it must be information that's true and correct, and you could actually be very misleading. You can also take a look at the YouTube video here that kind of goes over a description of the post-event misinformation effect. Specific terms that go along with the post-event misinformation effect are what's called proactive interference. And what proactive interference is, and this is something that we talked about back in chapter 4, is the inability to learn new material because old material keeps interfering with something. And what that means is that we have information that's already stored. It becomes long-term. It becomes part of a model that we use to retrieve information on a particular topic, and it interferes with us incorporating new information. The retroactive interference, which is the misinformation effect, is when we can't recall old material or we make errors in recalling old material because new information has interfered with it. So in the example of that crime, if you have a crime that's been committed and the eyewitness saw it, and then they hear some testimony about the crime that conflicts with what they saw, it may confuse them. They may adopt it as their own story, kind of like what we mentioned in the previous slide. So that's kind of that retroactive interference where the old information is more difficult to recall because new information interferes with it. And in the Loftus study, which comes again from the text, roughly on page 100 and then 99. 100 is where this comes from, the chart. This demonstrates the likelihood or the percentage of times people recalled a correct detail about a slide that they had seen. So they saw a picture, and it had a picture of a traffic scenario, and they were asking the people questions about the traffic scenario. And the traffic scenario had, for example, a yield sign. And the questionnaire would say something like, did somebody drive by the car parked at the stop sign? And then what would happen is later they would ask the question, was there a stop sign or a yield sign? And the people would not rely on the information from the slide, which was the true information. They would use the post-event misinformation effect. So, for example, everybody saw the yield sign on the slide, but the questionnaire said, hey, was there a car that passed the car at the stop sign? And then the people thought, oh, it must have been a stop sign because the post-event misinformation effect takes over. New information was added or different information was added and conflicted with what they already knew through retroactive interference. So when the information was consistent, there was a pretty good recall rate. But when inconsistent information was presented, the recall rate decreases over time based on the recall of the details of the traffic scenario. So eyewitness testimony has some factors to it. Because we know that emotion is tied to our ability to both recall and encode information, so retrieve and encode information, that people who saw the crime being committed and there was some kind of violent aspect to it or stressful circumstance, they have a harder time recalling information, retrieving information. The longer the delay, the more difficult it is to retrieve information accurately. Probably not a surprise to you because memory does fail, especially if it's not rehearsed over that period of time. And then if the misinformation about the event is plausible, then it can interfere because if there's something that's semantically related to a detail but it's incorrect, then it's more likely to interfere. So, for example, if I say that somebody broke into my office and took my Snickers bar, And then if somebody saw that happen to me, they saw somebody come in and steal my Snickers bar, and then later I said, hey, somebody snuck in and stole my Kit Kat. The eyewitness, the person who witnessed it happen, is likely to believe that because it's misinformation, but it's plausible that it could have been a Kit Kat and not a Snickers bar. And they might adopt that because that's what they heard me say after the most recent thing. So that's kind of that retroactive interference piece again, where we adopt new information even if it's incorrect, especially if it's plausible, which is what point 3 is trying to make. Eyewitnesses also make more errors if there is social pressure. So if somebody witnessed a crime and people want that person to go to jail for what they've done, okay, they are likely to make mistakes or to respond in an indecisive way by saying something like, I don't know. Especially if what they witnessed is different than what's expected of them. Also, people are more likely to make mistakes in eyewitness testimony if the person has provided positive feedback, if someone has given positive feedback. So for example, if the eyewitness now believes that somebody took my Kit Kat, and I asked them, and somebody says, what happened in there? And they said, oh, well, somebody took Dr. Haggerty's Kit Kat bar. They'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. All of a sudden that reinforces the eyewitness testimony, even though it's incorrect because somebody agreed with it. And we have a propensity to want to be agreeable. So in that case, the eyewitness testimony not only now includes false information, but it's more likely to be perpetuated because somebody has reinforced the false information. The fallibility of eyewitness testimony kind of brings us into the home stretch here. I know this is a longer lecture, sorry. But there's a recovered memory versus false memory controversy that happens. So in general, we can recover memories, and one of the arguments is that when things come flooding back into consciousness, how do we know that they are valid and reasonable recollections of what happened? So the memory for traumatic events, kind of like something like childhood sexual abuse, may not be thought about for a very long time, right? We don't like to think about these things, and then all of a sudden they come back into our consciousness, maybe because something triggers us. We watch a movie about the same topic and it reminds us of something, whatever it is, it comes flooding back into our consciousness. Okay. The false memory perspective says that that a lot of those recovered memories are actually incorrect because they are constructed rather than reproduced. And that again harkens back to the idea that our memories are generally reconstructed as opposed to reproduced. Reconstructed means that we piece them back together every time. Reproduced means that they are the same every time. Okay, so in that way, we kind of know that we have a disposition for recovered memories being false, especially if they happen over lots of time, and because we also know that our perception of what had happened is through our current lens. So our current lens of understanding is applied to the prior experience, and when we reconstruct it, we're not reconstructing it from our initial perspective as like a child, for example. We're reconstructing it from the lens of an adult, which gets a different spin on it. That's not to say that people don't have valid memories that come back. It's that they are susceptible, and we have to be able to piece them back together in accurate ways. So once again, the same memory errors are kind of present here as they are for eyewitness testimony. And that means that your memory is less than perfect. Social pressure enhances the likelihood of memory errors because we want to perform something, especially if we're trying to convince somebody of something. We might change at least the intensity of our experience to match it. And then the accuracy of early memories is not easy to determine because nobody can verify them to know if they are accurate or not. One of the best examples of this recovered versus false memory is the Rodinger-McDermott studies. Sometimes they're just called false memory studies. And in these cases, you're asked to remember lists of words and then to identify whether new words were on the original list or not. And what's interesting about this is that people misidentify the words from the new list as being on the old list about half the time. So half the words they think were on the original list, but were not on the original list. And this is called an intrusion error, meaning that there is something semantically linked. So for example, if I say the words to you, bed, rest, awake, tired, and dream, and then I asked you to look at a list of words that are related to it, and I ask you if that a particular word was on it, yes or no, and I say the word yawn, you're likely to say yes because it's semantically related to the words bed, rest, awake, tired, and dream. But you would be wrong, and we have a hard time remembering I shouldn't say the word remember. We have a hard time identifying accurately if what we heard before was what we actually heard before, or if it isn't because we've semantically linked something because we have fallible memories. It's a very common study, by the way. If you want to look at some YouTube videos on it, I'm sure you can find something. Okay. So some of the arguments for the false memory, again, is that research that does demonstrate that participants can create these false memories, and that some people do not claim to remember the event that did not occur, but a certain percentage of them do. So that's kind of an interesting argument. Read through it in the text, but that's one of the arguments that goes into it. Arguments for recovered memory that say that recovered memories are valid is that the lab studies that have been done don't show ecological validity, meaning that maybe there's something different that happens in the real world compared to the lab setting. Another example is that people only seem to have recovered memories for certain contexts. For example, not embarrassing events. So people can't be forced into creating a memory for some particular context. And the studies on that are interesting too. It's difficult to get good lab value tests on this because we're trying to test ecological validity in the labs. It actually doesn't lend itself to ecological validity. That's enough for this time. I think we've done enough here. So that's chapter 5. It's a little bit longer. Sorry, there's a lot that goes into it. Again, skim through the reading if you have particular hang-ups on some of the material or want more details on the material than I provided here in the lecture, which is reasonable because it's a lecture. It's not designed to be the book. If you have any questions, certainly reach out, and I look forward to seeing the work you produce as a result.